Hi, everybody. Welcome to our FedTalks fireside chat on modernizing Congress. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm FedScoop editor-in-chief Billy Mitchell, and it's my delight to chat today with Congressman Derek Kilmer of Washington. Derek Kilmer is the chair of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Congressman Kilmer, thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to the program.
You bet. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. So I'm very excited to talk about this very loaded and expansive topic about Congress's involvement of technology, the modernization of Congress. I know you guys just came out with your final report a few years in the making. So I'd love to start our conversation today by diving into that final report from the Select Committee and hearing about what your committee found and it is needed to modernize Congress. And I think our audience today might be particularly interested in modernizing House technology, but also just kind of throw it all out there. What did you find that was important over these few years in kind of diving into this space?
Yeah, maybe let me start off for folks who haven't followed this closely with what the committee was. Every few decades or so, Congress recognizes that things aren't working the way they ought to, and they create a committee to try to do something about it. And this year's committee, as you mentioned, is called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. And it was sort of nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee. And the committee was set up as part of the House Rules package in early 2019. And it was truly bipartisan. 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. We were originally given just 1 year to do our work, but then we actually got extended through the end of the 116th. And you mentioned we've come out with a final report. We really worked together across party lines with an eye towards producing real results. We ended up passing nearly 100 bipartisan recommendations, all under the broad umbrella of just trying to make Congress work better for the American people. Um, Doing anything that bipartisan can be hard in this environment, particularly in the midst of a rather tumultuous year that included impeachment, COVID, and some other hurdles along the way. Um, I will mention also, we're a committee that, like past versions of this, doesn't have legislative authority. We make recommendations, but we've actually already turned around about 30 of our recommendations into legislation, which passed the House back in March. And we plan to do the same with our remaining recommendations. Our mandate, as you mentioned, was pretty broad. We were generally tasked with trying to make Congress work better. And one of the big areas of opportunity was House technology and trying to modernize and revitalize House technology. We made a lot of great recommendations in this space. I would say I think there's more work to do, and I would invite people to check out our report. Where our website's just modernizedcongress.house.gov. Technology is a big area of opportunity. One of my colleagues said Congress is an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems, and I think that's largely true. We've seen technology evolve very quickly, and Congress falls behind very quickly too. And we heard about that from a lot of our colleagues and from a lot of the staff about how to make the House more just tech proficient. Maybe I'll dive into some specifics, and I will tell you, I know this gets rather inside baseball very quickly,
Love inside
but I
baseball.
think I think your listenership may be may be unique in having an interest in this. So some of our proposals were oriented toward reforming the House Information Resources, which oversees technology in the House. Um, Making sure that there's a streamlined approval process for outside technology vendors so that Congress can take on new technologies quicker, enabling member offices to beta test new technologies. Um, you know, uh, we had recommendations around providing technologies to improve engagement with our constituents. So much of the discussion around House communications was based on a franking system that involved snail mail, and we know that there's new realities in the year 2020 and beyond. I mentioned some of it was oriented towards the House information resources, and we've made some proposed reforms specifically, ensuring that there's a single point of contact between House offices and HIR, providing some means of member feedback regarding outside vendors and HIR services, almost sort of Yelpifying the work that HIR does. Um, We've proposed establishing a congressional digital services task force to, kind of examine the need for and the role of a specialized group of technologists and designers and others to support not just the House internal operations, but also some of the public facing operations as well. And then we also proposed making permanent the bulk data task force and renaming it the Congressional Data Task Force. That was established initially with a focus on the question of determining whether Congress should make the data behind Thomas and the LIS available to the public as structured data. And the task force completed its initial mission, and in doing so, actually brought together many of the technology stakeholders inside the legislative branch, as well as members of civil society. And they continue to hold public meetings and have forged a really productive working relationship. And so we thought there was value in making that effort permanent. I guess, and maybe this has been an answer that was far more detailed than you wanted in the
That's
first place,
okay.
but I think it's also worth mentioning that we actually used some of the new technologies to modernize the way we made our final report public. We actually teamed up with the Government Publishing Office to create and print the report using their XPub technology. The Select Committee is the first congressional committee to use that technology with GPO to produce a committee report that's way more modern, way more user friendly. In addition to the GPO report, the final report is also on an interactive website to highlight report findings and recommendations. And so, again, if you visit modernize congress.house.gov, all of that. And then there's a /final-report that has all of that information that folks can poke around on.
That's great. Thank you for the depth on that. It's very cool to see you guys sort of using those own recommendations and sort of, as they say in the tech world, eating your own dog food. So very cool to hear about that. I'd like to turn now to the pandemic because obviously everybody moved to a point. Some are moving back, but remote work and telework and things of that nature, virtual conferencing, things of that nature have skyrocketed, to put it the least. And we heard stories where the House, the Senate weren't able to hold sessions because they didn't want people to be together. And these technologies were vastly important, except there wasn't the foundational elements in place to support it. So I'd love to talk about, how has the pandemic impacted congressional use of technology, and did it really kind of further emphasize this need to modernize, that really proved the point of having a select committee like this, that Congress, like you said, is an 18th century institution that really needs to be kind of propelled forward.
Yeah, the short answer is big time, right? Once the pandemic hit, Congress went into remote operating status. To your point, our committee actually decided to keep meeting. We met virtually. We had virtual discussions, looking at issues specifically related to the pandemic and Congress's use of technology, among some other things. We looked at, continuity of committee work, which includes technology. We looked at tech capacity in Congress because one of the things that became clear pretty early on in the pandemic was, a lot of offices simply did not even have the technology for remote work, and weren't necessarily following best practices with regard to cybersecurity and things like that. We also looked at some of the best practices in state and foreign legislative bodies. Some countries were way ahead of the curve and had remote voting systems in place for members of parliament who may, for one reason or another, be unable to travel to their capital. Spain, for example. The state level experiences we found kind of a mixed bag, as you would expect. Some moved quickly and had remote procedures. Others were more resistant. You know, some states implemented some kind of interesting social distancing practices, like meeting in outdoor sports arenas and that type of thing. So, keep in mind, our committee wasn't tasked with looking specifically at remote voting issues. That was a House admin and House rules conversation. But we tried to look at some of the other issues that kind of were part and parcel of the pandemic. We also took a lot of time to solicit feedback on how remote operations were going from our colleagues and from staff, both in DC and in the districts. Um, I will tell you, prior to the pandemic, we'd already looked at a number of issues around technology and made a number of recommendations that turned out to be pretty helpful, um, as we work to move to remote operating status. So, for example, things like e-signatures, you know, not requiring a wet signature on everything because, um, while people are social distancing in the pandemic, that's required. But we'd already looked at that issue just as a matter of efficiency. Things like bringing on new house approved technologies like WebEx and rolling out Teams, Microsoft Teams to all staffers. We had made recommendations around trying to expedite the approval of technologies, and to the credit of House admin, and of the technologists in the House, there was a quick effort to approve some of those technologies. And then we also ended up making a whole bunch of recommendations, related to continuity of operations, so that they're, to address things like cybersecurity training and telework training, and the notion that every member of Congress should have training on cybersecurity, on telework. Every office should have a continuity plan and a telework plan. That is just not the case, prior to this pandemic. We made a recommendation around ensuring that staff have the most up-to-date technology and equipment so that they can continue effectively working on behalf of constituents. If you see a disruption, if you have an emergency like this, making sure that there's regular maintenance plans for office technology so that the equipment and technology that's needed during remote operations and to do telework is functional and, is cyber secure. We made recommendations around casework. Again, so much of that process is over, kind of hard copy sheets of paper, trying to help constituents access federal agencies and resources, by having secure document management systems, having digital forms, having templates for public access. Those were things that, what's the saying, necessity is the mother of invention. You've started to see that turn over the course of the pandemic. And a lot of those changes, in my view, ought to be made permanent. Um, I guess those are some of the big things. I could go into the weeds on some other stuff, but I think, even looking at how committees, I think at the beginning of each Congress, committees should develop some bipartisan plans on how technology and innovative platforms could be incorporated into daily work. That was one of our recommendations, and I think that's important too.
Great. Well, that's great context for what's been going on, and I think we have a couple more minutes here. What I would like to spend it on, the education and the awareness and the insight of members of Congress on these topics, because as we've seen in some high-profile technology based hearings, we all kind of, our mind draws back to the quote unquote Facebook hearing where they bring these high profile CEOs in front, and it's not necessarily the use of the technology, but their sort of awareness and understanding of what's going on around these new solutions and technologies and social medias and things like that are now dominating our society. And there's maybe outside of your own select committee, there doesn't tend to be a great grasp of what's going on. So I wondered, your thoughts, and perhaps how your committee, if at all, has thought about educating others around Congress so there's a more meaningful dialogue and how these things, how Congress oversees these things that are starting to really take a major impact on our society.
I think it's really important. You are correct. These are really substantive, important matters, and that Congress needs to have intelligence on. And that can be hard. I came out of the business world. I worked in economic development. I was a management consultant, in consulting firm's IT practice. And so I had a lot of exposure to these issues, but not, one of the values of Congress is people come from all walks of life. And, and members are pulled in 100 different directions. So understanding and really understanding technology issues takes a lot of time, and oftentimes time is what members of Congress lack. And so some of our recommendations, I think, get us moving in the right direction when it comes to educating ourselves. So for example, we recommended reestablishing an improved Office of Technology Assessment, OTA, to study and recommend emerging technologies, to provide nonpartisan information and policy analysis to member offices. So you're not just leaning on your own staff, but that we're actually building some capacity within the Congress, to support legislative branch agencies as they examine new technologies, to focus on oversight and on policy. All of those things, I think we felt would go a long way in terms of helping members and their staff get more up to speed on technology issues. We also recommended creating a pilot congressional leadership academy for members to offer professional development and institutional training. So, some of our members talked about how they would like to receive more training on technology issues. And so having, it's strange, right now there's mandatory training that members of Congress have to take, but it's one of the few workplaces that I've ever worked in that doesn't really have any professional development opportunities for members. There is a staff academy, and we actually made some proposals around enhancing the staff academy too. But once you've gone through freshman orientation as a member of Congress, there's not much in the way of continuing education, and that should change. It is an opportunity for members of Congress to get better at their jobs, and I think the American people want members of Congress to get better at their jobs. And then finally, as I mentioned, we made a recommendation regarding making cybersecurity training mandatory. Members of Congress are high value targets, and unfortunately, not all members follow best practices in terms of cybersecurity, and you can see very substantial ramifications of that. So we made a recommendation on that front as well.
I think those are great recommendations. Real quickly, as we close out, maybe in a minute or less, I'd like to look ahead to 2021. A lot of this year obviously has been focused on the pandemic, and with modernization tech issues that are involved in that. We think of virtual remote environments, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, things like that. Also, we've heard about social media a lot this year. But what other issues that involve Congress and technology might we anticipate to come around next year?
I think we're likely to continue to see technology be part of a conversation as it relates to continuity of government operations. And I actually think there's more conversation to have around continuity issues, and also around remote work. I think remote work is going to be our reality well into 2021. You know, to its credit, the House has already made a number of adjustments, in part related to the pandemic. So allowing for the use of digital signatures, and allowing for committee reports to be submitted electronically, and having the ability for committees to operate remotely and hold hearings, and even holding votes if certain requirements are met. But I think we're going to continue to see Congress adapt and adjust, and I think this, is also going to be the case when it comes to communicating with our constituents. Members are adapting more innovative approaches to staying in touch with their constituents, and I think we'll see these discussions around technologies and best practices continue to evolve. At least I hope so.
That's great. Congressman Kilmer, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to watching closely to see what comes of your committee's work.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And again, I encourage everybody to check out modernizecongress.house.gov.
Absolutely.